Hey everybody, this is section 1 of part 2 of chapter 2 of part 1 of Ingo Elbe's Marx in the West. Again, using a Google Translate for this, so we might not be, it's probably not the greatest, but for my purposes, which is to kind of get the gist of the entire book, which is all I'd remember anyway. This should be sufficient. If one day someone actually translates this book professionally, I'd love to read that as well. But anyway, chapter 2 of part 1 of the book is titled Logical, Historical, Dialectical, a departure from the methodological tradition and debates on the specificity of the Marxian method. The heading that I'm reading today, the section that I'm reading today, section 1 is titled Key Features of Methodological Orthodoxy and the Emergence of Neo-Orthodoxy. In the early 1970s, a methodological counter-concept to the logico-historical orthodoxy existed only in rudimentary form within the contributions of the Frankfurt Tradition of a, quote, new reading of Marx. The following discussion aims to trace, by way of example, the elaboration of this concept, which would subsequently rise to prominence as the, quote, logico-systemic method, end quote, a process that took place primarily between 1970 and 1977, and which is found above all, quote, with a time lag relative to the Frankfurt discussion, end quote, in contributions emerging from circles in West Berlin. As early as the colloquia marking 100 years of Marx's Capital, the question regarding the relationship between, quote, capital in general and, quote, many capital / competition was a subject of discussion, even if particularly in the work of Roman Rosdolsky, some initial ambiguities regarding this matter can still be identified. The so-called, quote, plan change debate, which began in the 1960s and gained considerable momentum in the 1970s, addresses the specific question of whether the distinction, formulated by Marx in his original 6-book plan for the critique of political economy, namely that between capital in general and competition, continues to exert a structuring influence on the development of categories within capital. 3 fundamental positions can be distinguished in this regard. 1. Marx implicitly retained this differentiation, but abandoned the principled separation of the 2 levels within capital. 2. He has retained this separation within capital, in the strict sense as well. Later, a further position was advanced. Let me repeat that sentence. 3 fundamental positions can be distinguished in this regard. 1. Marx implicitly retained this differentiation, but abandoned the principled separation of the 2 levels within capital, the book. Marx retained this separation within capital, in the strict sense as well. Later, a further position was advanced. 3. He abandoned this conceptualization in capital for substantive reasons, replacing this conceptualization with a structure based on the distinction between individual capital and total social capital. Quite apart from these differences, however, The participants in this debate generally agree that both capital in general, understood as the determinations of the wealth form of capital, in contradistinction to mere money and abstracting from the properties accruing to it through the interaction of individual capitals and competition, understood as the law-governed interaction of individual capitals, constitute the subject matter of the critique of political economy as a, quote, general analysis of capital, unquote, or respectively of its, quote, ideal average. The conceptual ascent from the abstract to the concrete in Marx's Capital thus operates entirely within the scope of the general concept of capital. That is, within those determinations of modern forms of wealth that must be conceptually developed as constitutive elements of capital, and does not take as its subject matter the empirical surface, in the sense of the actual historical situation of a specific society or epoch within the capitalist social formation. What Marx identifies as lying, quote, outside our plan, namely the, quote, real movement of competition, refers to empirical market processes such as cheating, actual wage trends in specific countries or industries, or, quote, local obstacles to the formation of an average rate of profit. In Marx's Capital, to summarize this discussion, a general concept of capital is thus developed which, quote, alongside the exposition of the essence of the capitalist mode of production, unquote, that is, of the empirically unobservable, law-governed interconnections, quote, also contains the exposition of the necessary forms of appearance of this essence, i.e. of competition, I'm going to repeat that sentence, reflected the exclamation points. In Marx's Capital, to summarize this discussion, a general concept of capital is thus developed which, quote, alongside the exposition of the essence of the capitalist mode of production, unquote, that is, of the empirically unobservable, law-governed interconnections, quote, also contains the exposition of the necessary forms of appearance of this essence, i.e. of competition as a general phenomenon, end quote. The subject matter consists of, quote, the essential determinations of capitalism, that which amidst all historical change must remain constant if we are able to speak of, quote, capitalism at all, end quote. These include both the core structural class relationship and the formation of an average rate of profit through competition, as well as the inverted forms of appearance of non-empirical essential determinations manifested in the fetishism of money, capital, or interest. A specific type of capital reception, Marx's capital reception, however, conflates precisely these necessary forms of appearance, or this, quote, surface of bourgeois society in its ideal average, with the real historical determinations of a specific epoch. I'm going to repeat that. These include both the core structure as well as the inverted forms of appearance of non-empirical essential determinations manifested in the fetishism of money, capital, or interest. A specific type of capital reception, however, conflates precisely these necessary forms of appearance, or this, quote, surface of bourgeois society in its ideal average, with the real historical determinations of a specific epoch. The debate concerning the subject matter of Marx's Capital, a discussion conducted even within the Orthodox tradition, and generally regarded as rather innocuous and philological, thus transitions into a rejection of central methodological and object theoretical assumptions underlying the prevailing understanding of Marx. Diese Where the hell am I? These assumptions were subjected to a more explicit attack in 1970 in a review of Ernest Mandel's book, Marxist Economic Theory, written by a collective of authors led by Veit Michael Bader and Joachim Bischoff. In his voluminous work, Mandel attempts, among other things, to substantiate Engel's theory of simple commodity production by drawing upon ethnological data. In contrast, Bader and his co-authors observe that Mandel, unlike Marx, quote, seeks to derive historically the contradictions that emerge from a logical analysis of exchange relations, unquote. Bader and Bischoff criticized Mandel's premise, namely a, quote, immediate identity between economic theory and economic history, unquote, characterizing it as a, quote, inability to sustain methodological abstractions for the purpose of analyzing specific moments, unquote, and as an empiricist tendency to, quote, cling to mere appearances, unquote. Bader and Bischoff argue that this approach has repercussions for Mandel's theory of money, which, being presented merely as a historical account of the relationship between commodities and money, quote, fails to advance beyond the positions of bourgeois economics, unquote. Bader and Bischoff. However, these observations regarding the fundamental conflict between a historicist conception of method and subject matter on the one hand, and Marx's, quote, logical mode of development, proceeding through successive levels of abstraction on the other, ultimately failed to progress beyond the stage of mere suggestion. In 1972, the orthodox core tenets regarding Marx's exposition of value theory, albeit solely in the guise of Lenin's understanding of the critique of political economy, were subjected to a more detailed critique by the West Berlin-based group Project Klassenanalyse, Project Class Analysis, led by Joachim Bischoff. According to this critique, Lenin generally conceives of Marx's Capital as a work tasked with tracing a historical process. A work tasked with tracing a historical process. The capitalist mode of production, quote, in its genesis, its development, and its decline, end quote. In doing so, one encounters all the topoi of traditional Marxist historicism and empiricism. Marx, it is argued, begins his exposition with an empirical, quote, relation observable billions of times over, end quote, commodity exchange. The subsequent analysis of the form of value is said to take as its subject, quote, the genesis of the money form of value, the investigation of the historical process of the development of exchange, from individual accidental acts of exchange, parenthesis, quote, simple, isolated, or accidental form of value, end quote, end parenthesis, up to the general form of value, end quote. And beneath its, quote, purely deductive form of exposition, end quote, to present, quote, a vast body of factual material regarding the genesis of exchange, end quote. Simple circulation appears as a model of the epoch of simple commodity production. The transformation of the law of appropriation is interpreted as a historical event marking the transition from this simple mode of production to the capitalist mode. Ultimately, according to Lenin, Marx's entire theory of capital operates on the level of appearances. Essential categories, such as that of value, are grasped merely as statistical average determinations of empirical processes. If, in Lenin's view, Marx's critique of political economy contains merely an empirical generalization of specific phenomenal forms of historical epochs, then the pure exposition of capitalism is understood as an exposition of pure capitalism. In this reading, Marx's Capital presents an account of two historical processes: the process of the emergence of capitalism out of simple commodity production, as well as the unfolding of capitalism from its, quote, primitive forms, simple cooperation and manufacture, end quote, up to large-scale industry. However, Marxist capital can then be understood only as a, quote, representation of the historical process of capitalist development up to a specific stage of development, end quote. Namely, the capitalism of free competition. New manifestations therefore demand a new theory of the current epoch of capitalism, which Lenin terms, quote, imperialism, or alternatively, quote, monopoly capitalism, or even, quote, state monopoly capitalism, end quote, and which entails a fundamental revision of Marxian categories, shifting toward a theory of directly coercive domination and appropriation. Criticism of the methodological historicizations inherent in the mode of presentation of Marxist capital is already clearly discernible here, even if this aspect is treated somewhat cursorily and the debate tends to gravitate toward questions of state theory. Consequently, no broader discussion of this contribution, specifically regarding the methodological aspect of Marx's critique of political economy, has subsequently taken place. The debate surrounding, quote, the logical or the historical in Marx's mode of presentation was truly set in motion only by an attempt by the Orthodox camp to salvage its position in 1974. Klaus Holtzkamp's essay elaborates in detail the fundamental tenets of the traditional Marxist reading of Marx's presentation. Holtzkamp's text serves as a response to the challenge posed by the, quote, logical reading, specifically in the form of books published the previous year by Joachim Bischoff and the Projekt Group on the development of the Marxian system. Parenthesis, PEM. Parenthesis. Holtzkamp's construction of a, quote, logical historical dialectical method takes as its starting point an interpretation of Engels' 1859 review. In a thoroughly plausible manner, Holtzkamp identifies two distinct meanings of the word, quote, historical within Engels' text. While Engels states that the critique of political economy can be structured in two ways, historically or logically, and that Marx opted for the logical approach, which is, however, quote, nothing other than the historical approach, merely stripped of its historical form and of disturbing contingencies, end quote. Engels. Holtzkamp argues that Engels is referring, on the one hand, to the historiography of actual historical developments, and on the other to the construction of an abstract model of historical lines of development. The former is designated as the, quote, actual historical dimension, and the latter as the, quote, logical historical dimension of scientific research and presentation. Holtzkamp proceeds to further distinguish three crucial functions of what he terms the, quote, historical method of scientific socialism, end quote. 1. The mode of presentation in Marx's Capital as a, quote, logico-historical reconstruction of the developmental logic of a real historical process. 2. The function of real historical analyses in clarifying the past preconditions of the capitalist mode of production. 3. The function of real historical analyses as evidence and illustration of the logico-historical presentation, as well as a basis for the derivation of research findings. The developmental logic emerges at the end of the research process as an empirical generalization. In methodological terms, Holtzkamp posits an interaction between a pre-understanding of the present, and the historical analysis of the developmental logic leading up to it. The task of dialectical explanation is then, quote, to grasp the essence of every concrete phenomenon by revealing its history, end quote. Such an explanation, serving as a presentation of research results, can, however, largely abstract from the famous, quote, disturbing contingencies, end quote, referred to here as, quote, contingencies of givenness, end quote. In this context, real historical analyses serve merely as illustrations or evidence for the historical model, no longer as an empirical, quote, basis for derivation, end quote. To be distinguished from this is the function outlined under point 2, which is intended to delineate the limits of the presentation assumed to be logico-historical. Subsumed under this category is everything that does not resolve into the, quote, developmentally necessary progression, end quote. Namely, contingent historical actors, processes, or facts, such as original accumulation in England, the linkage of the equivalent form to gold and silver, and so forth. The subject of Holtzkamp's polemic is the Bischoff-PEM thesis regarding a, quote, logical form of presentation in Marx's Capital, conceived as a structural analysis of the, quote, contemporary history, end quote, of the capitalist mode of production. Holtzkamp's text is to be read, in this context, as an inadvertent detector of inconsistencies within Bischoff's variant of a logical interpretation, specifically regarding the latter's obfuscation of the differences between Marx and Engels, as well as the historicist popularizations found in Marx's own work. However, Bischoff's forceful reinterpretation of Engels' historicizing methodological reflection on the critique of political economy is met by Holtzkamp with a no less forceful reinterpretation of Marx's own logical conception. The controversy between Holtzkamp and Bischoff thus bears witness to the dogmatic limitations of this debate, and indeed of the new Marx reading, Neue Marx-Lektura, during its early stages. The dogma shared by both sides is the assertion of an identity between Marx and Engels regarding their respective understandings of method and subject matter. Holtzkamp rightly notes that the logical consequence of Bischoff's, quote, logical interpretation of Marx would, quote, have to be a radical critique of Engels, end quote, given that it, quote, asserts the exact opposite of what is actually stated in Engels' text, end quote. Holtzkamp. Bischoff, however, in a manner that is both logically diffuse and contradictory, attempts to dismiss Engels' review as having been, quote, misunderstood by historicist interpreters. Holtzkamp also rejects as nonsensical the claim that the historical passages in Marx's Capital serve merely to illustrate the conceptual derivation. For how, after all, could something non-historical and non-empirical be illustrated historically? Indeed, within the Engelsian paradigm, the notion of a, quote, historical illustration of the logical, unquote, appears meaningful only insofar as it serves as an exemplary concretization of a historical empirical mode. In this regard, both operations are situated on the same theoretical plane. That is to say, they address a process that is largely empirically observable, albeit at different levels of abstraction. On the one hand, as the description of a specific process; on the other, as an abstracted, pointed, and idealized mode of historical trajectories and interconnections. Holtzkamp's reinterpretation of Marx as a historicist can rely only on a single piece of philological evidence within Marx's meta-theoretical reflections. Consequently, Holtzkamp undertakes a simple, quote, translation of Marxian concepts. The logical ones are now termed, quote, logical historical, and the historical ones, quote, real historical. Statements that clearly contradict this are simply ignored. For instance, the juxtaposition of the genesis, and the existence of capitalism, and the designation of the existence of capitalism as the specific object of the critique of political economy. Alternatively, it is presumed that these statements do not, in fact, concern the same subject matter as Engels' theses. However, since Holtzkamp seeks to base his reconstruction not on Marx's own methodological self-reflections, but rather on his actual analytical practice regarding the subject matter, his historicist-empiricist interpretation yields 4 points of reference, specifically in the context of the analysis of the form of value, of which one may be considered valid, while the others must be regarded as contrived. 1. Holtzkamp exploits the ambiguity of the terms, quote, development, quote, genesis, and, quote, progress, unhesitatingly interpreting every instance of their use within the framework of the value form analysis as evidence of a historicizing reading. The, quote, development of value forms is thus transformed into a historical process, or more precisely into an idealizing reconstruction thereof. 2. Furthermore, actual action theoretical aspects of the account of the genesis of money are cited as corroboration. In Holtzkamp's erroneous view, such statements cannot meaningfully be integrated into the context of a, quote, logical derivation. In doing so, he conflates, on the one hand, action theoretical statements with the real extra-theoretical process. On the other hand, he regards the second chapter of Marx's Capital as a mere, quote, extension of the derivation of money, end quote, wherein this, quote, extension is supposedly characterized by a lower degree of abstraction. Finally, Holtzkamp's assertion that a logically conceptual derivation of money from the general equivalent is impossible demonstrates that he has not grasped the argumentation of the PEM even in the most rudimentary sense. For, as will be elaborated elsewhere, it is precisely this observation that constitutes the crux of their account regarding the qualitative difference between the first two chapters of Marx's Capital. However, unlike the PEM, Holtzkamp also denies any logical necessity or justifiability to the movement from Form 1 to Form 3 within the value form analysis. 3. Historical statements, which Marx did indeed unjustifiably insert into the value form analysis, e.g. regarding the process by which gold emerged as the preferred money commodity, are marshaled as counter-arguments against a logical examination of the, quote, genesis of the money form, end quote. End quote. 4. While Holtzkamp was already able, in point 3, to draw upon a popularization of Marx's exposition in the second edition of the book Capital, a popularization which, however, he neither identifies as such nor with which truly stands in contradiction to the explanatory claim of a logically systematic exposition of the genesis of the money form. In a final step, Holtzkamp refers to actual historicizations of the value form analysis undertaken by Marx. In doing so, Holtzkamp uncovers flawed popularizations which are still overlooked by the PEM, but which he himself fails to recognize as such. Instead, they serve him as evidence for his Marx equals Engels dogma. Significantly, Holtzkamp manages simultaneously to cite or co-cite statements by Marx that fundamentally contradict his own approach, while at the same time overlooking them. Holtzkamp conceives of the necessity of the interconnection of economic forms, here specifically of the commodity, the simple, expanded, and general forms of value, and money, as a, quote, material developmental necessity, end quote. That is, as the logic of a historical process in which complex forms emerge from simple ones through the resolution of systematically induced pragmatic problem situations. The deficiencies inherent in the forms of value are understood as practical problems of social organization arising from a past era of simple barter exchange, problems that manifest themselves as a state of, quote, distress. Parenthesis, not, in parenthesis. Demanding a, quote, turn or shift, Wendung. Namely, a conscious act of problem solving grounded in an equally conscious insight into the nature of said problems. The, quote, necessity of this development is construed neither as a matter of logical implications between concepts nor as a historical causal series governed by deterministic laws. Rather, it is understood as the practical necessity of an empirical problem of economic social organization, a problem that can be resolved through conscious recognition and action on the part of the actors involved, though it is not bound to be so resolved, specifically through the introduction, indeed the very invention of a, quote, higher economic form. Consequently, within Holtzkamp's framework, the unconscious, albeit consciousness-mediated, constitution of forms of wealth through social practice is conceptually ruled out. For a practice devoid of insight and consciousness would inevitably fail to address the specific problem situations at hand, as well as the solutions attainable through the adoption of more complex forms. Thus, the notion of, quote, acting before one has thought, end quote, Marx, and indeed the entire problematic of fetishism, is effectively excluded from this, quote, logico-historical construct of dialectical exposition. These questions are, in fact, deemed by Holtzkamp to be unworthy of even a passing mention. Dialectics is therefore nothing other than a historical causal analysis conducted at a high and in part ideal-typical level of abstraction, the categories of which are entirely empirical in nature. For Holtzkamp, a non-empirical theoretical plane is tantamount to a, quote, reality-detached, self-sufficient thought experiment, end quote. One second. So I just want to make sure I'm following along properly. Let me reread the last sentence that I remember reading. Thus, the notion of, quote, acting before one is thought, end quote, Marx, and indeed the entire problematic of fetishism, is effectively excluded from this, quote, logico-historical construct of dialectical exposition. These questions are, in fact, deemed by Holtzkamp to be unworthy of even a passing mention. Dialectics is therefore nothing other than a historical causal analysis conducted at a high and in part ideal-typical level of abstraction, the categories of which are entirely empirical in nature. For Holtzkamp, a non-empirical theoretical plane is tantamount to a, quote, reality-detached, self-sufficient thought experiment, end quote. In this way, the concept of essence, in terms of its epistemological status, is inverted into that of form of appearance. All economic phenomena are matters lying openly exposed to the actors to be uncovered through historical empirical observation. Their only difference lies in the fact that the essence, refers to an empirical context that is past, and, in the present resulting from it, forgotten. Thus, following Lenin, dialectics becomes a more substantively rich theory of development. The consequence of this, a point that would only later be highlighted in West German discourse by Hans-Georg Backhaus, is an empiricist understanding of the categories of the critique of political economy and a pre-monetary theory of value that conceives of the, quote, introduction, not only of money, but of all economic forms, according to the pattern of a, quote, cleverly devised expedient, end quote. Indeed, according to the model of emancipatory, consensual, and conscious practice. Commodities and their value forms are seen as existing in isolation, and temporarily prior to money, within specific stages of historical development. Their interconnection is merely one of historical succession, one that could only be established through the insightful agency of the actors, and is therefore external and contingent. Thus, according to Holtzkamp, the critique of political economy generates action-theoretical problem-solving models derived from historical empirical research. Finally, at the methodological level, the limits of dialectical exposition, as articulated by Marx, are by the very nature of this approach necessarily missed. Unlike Holtzkamp, as Alfred Schmidt has already demonstrated, Marx does not speak of contingency as a limit to an idealized presentation of historical developments, but rather of the limits of the object's own systematicity as the limit of dialectical representation. If the self-reproductiveness of the mode of production under investigation reaches its limit, namely those presuppositions it has not posited itself, then historical inquiry must intervene to trace its genesis, thereby avoiding a fallacious circularity, explaining the original emergence of capital in terms of capital itself. However, knowledge of this genesis is neither a prerequisite for understanding capital in capital's developed form, as Marx clearly emphasizes, nor is it, even in the most abstracted form, the subject matter of the logical systematic exposition. The true subject of the logical systematic exposition is the systematic interconnection of, quote, bourgeois society and bourgeois society's developed state moving upon its own foundations, end quote. The response of the Projekt Klassenanalyse, PKA, to Holzkamp's theses appeared later that very same year. At this juncture, however, we shall set aside both the Leninist style of polemics employed therein and the crude determinism already rightly criticized by Holzkamp that characterizes the Projekt Klassenanalyse's approach in the form of its, quote, reflex theory and philosophy of history. These matters will be addressed in the third part of this study, which examines the positions on revolutionary theory associated with the, quote, new Marx reading. Yet even within the context of the specific subject matter at hand, a few observations are warranted regarding the argumentative methodology of the various project groups led by Johann Bischoff. Groups that exemplify the practice of reconstructing Marx, quote, within an ethos of demarcation, end quote. Indeed, a defining characteristic of these groups is what Hans-Georg Backhaus would later term a, quote, Lutheran conception of Marxian reconstruction. When Bischoff posits the, quote, rethinking of Marx's, when Bischoff posits the rethinking of Marx's ideas as the central object of his endeavors, this entails first and foremost a neo-orthodox disregard for the history of Marx's reception up to that point. Bischoff and his associates proceed as if one need only finally, quote, read what is written there, end quote, in order to generate a, quote, logical interpretation of Marx's critique of political economy, for, quote, the text is treated as unambiguous, internally consistent, and self-evident. Despite making some tentative gestures toward acknowledging instances of, quote, popularization in Marx's writings, they make no attempt whatsoever to investigate the underlying reasons and causes behind the interpretive paradigm that had prevailed until that time. Instead, they engage in the vacuous practice of superficially pigeonholing theoretical positions by arbitrarily linking them to reprehensible, quote, petty bourgeois class standpoints. Illustrative of this approach is, on the one hand, the entirely unelaborated assertion, at this juncture we shall set aside both the Leninist style... Oh, what the fuck? God damn it. 1 second. Sorry about that. In the middle of reading that, I realized I fucked up the whole paragraph. So I'm going to repeat. I fixed it, and hopefully the rest of the recording will be at least somewhat smooth. The response of the Project Klassen Analyse to Holtzkamp's theses appeared later that same year. At this juncture, however, we shall set aside both the Leninist style of polemics and the crude determinism, already rightly criticized by Holtzkamp, that characterizes the PKA's approach in the form of reflex theory and philosophy of history. These matters will be addressed in the third part of this study, which examines the positions on revolutionary theory associated with the, quote, new Marx reading. Yet, even within the context of the subject matter currently under discussion, a few remarks are warranted regarding the argumentative methodology employed by the various project groups surrounding Joachim Bischoff. Groups that exemplify the work of reconstructing Marx, quote, within an environment of demarcation, end quote. Indeed, a defining characteristic of these groups is what Hans-Georg Backhaus would later term a, quote, Lutheran conception of Marxian reconstruction. When Bischoff posits the rethinking of Marx's ideas as the central task of Bischoff's endeavors, this implies, first and foremost, a neo-orthodox disregard for the history of reception that is unfolded thus far. Bischoff et al. Proceed as if one need only finally, quote, read what is written there, end quote, in order to generate a, quote, logical interpretation of Marx's critique of political economy. For, quote, the text is treated as unambiguous, internally consistent, and self-evident, despite certain tentative efforts to identify instances of popularization in Marx's writings. No attempt is made, not even a cursory one, to investigate the underlying reasons and causes behind the interpretive paradigm that had prevailed up to that point. Instead, the practice is to engage in vacuous superficial correlations, mechanically linking theoretical positions to, in their view, reprehensible, quote, petty bourgeois class standpoints. Characteristic of this situation is, on the one hand, the rejection, devoid of even the slightest hint of explanation, of Holtzkamp's pertinent criticism of Bischoff's conflation of the genetic and validity-based foundations of scientific socialism. The absence of original arguments is masked by caustic polemics and by pointing to a, quote, idealistic cult of Genesis, end quote, as the alleged consequence of demanding independent scientific reflection on validity. On the other hand, no attention is paid to Holtzkamp's demonstration of the incompatibility between Engels' review of the critique and the form of logical methodological reflection. Here, matters of sheer faith simply preclude any scholarly engagement with the works of Marx and Engels. Although Project Klassen Analyse, as has been shown, put forward a detailed critique of Lenin's historicist interpretation of capital as early as 1972, every reference to the Engelsian sources of Lenin's understanding of Marx is here scrupulously avoided. Ultimately, the critical rethinking of Marx's argumentation is all too often supplanted by by an unannotated retelling. Thus, quotations from Marx are extensively woven into the theoretical discussion without being explicitly identified as such. Alternatively, Marx's 19th century orthography is simply adopted wholesale. All in all, a highly peculiar form of hermeneutic, quote, self-effacement that has been aptly described as, quote, mere conflation of theory, philosophy, and philology. I don't know what orthography means. I'm trying to avoid looking things up, but I feel like I won't learn unless I stop and do this. Orthography is the standardized system of writing a language encompassing spelling, punctuation, capitalization, and word formation rules. Okay. Despite the reductionist narrative regarding the betrayal of the proletarian class standpoint, a narrative that even the adversary Klaus Holtzkamp masters so well that it seems as if the aim were to justify oneself before an invisible Politburo, the PKA initially points out the real political implications of the historicist reading. If, accordingly, the sequence of categories in Marx's Capital is understood as historical, then the first volume is regarded as a mere depiction of the epoch of free competition capitalism, as to be followed by an epoch of monopolies in which planning and market power replace competition. This entails consequences particularly regarding the assessment of modern statehood. Its power structure, and its capacity for intervention, which are examined in the second part of this study. In terms of content, the PKA refines its, quote, logical interpretation of Marx's Capital in opposition to Holtzkamp's thesis, namely that the, quote, starting point of the analysis within the given capitalist mode of production constitutes merely a preliminary and tentative grasp of it, whereas the, quote, execution, conceived as a model-like reconstruction of its historical genesis, is what first enables a true comprehension of the present, a process achieved through the ascent from the abstract to the concrete. In contrast, the PKA aptly invokes Marx's critique of the incomplete and erroneous abstractions of political economy, specifically its tendency to stop short at, quote, labor in general, without clarifying its distinction as value-forming labor from concrete labor, and its tendency to disregard all, quote, intermediate links, end quote, between the theoretical and empirical levels within its exposition. While the physiocrats still regard a specific natural form of labor as value-forming, the political economy that followed them focuses on the quantity of value, and assumes labor as such to be value-forming. Or so maybe it says sans phrase, which I don't really know. Let me look somewhere else. Yeah, sorry. Let me repeat that. I fucked that up and put my own stank on it. So it says, where the hell am I? While the physiocrats still regard a specific natural form of labor as value-forming, the political economy that followed them focuses on the quantity of value and assumed labor, sans phrase, to be value-forming. In doing so, according to Marx, the post-physiocrat political economy, I'm assuming that's what this it means, implicitly draws an unconscious distinction between concrete and abstract labor. Just as, since the time of Smith, it had unconsciously distinguished between use value and exchange value. According to Marx, however, the merely quantitative difference between different forms of labor presupposes their qualitative equality, namely abstract labor, a concept upon which political economy, for its part, fails to reflect. Not only does Marx thereby reflect, as the PKA argues, upon the unacknowledged presuppositions of political economic argumentation. Furthermore, it is precisely the complete conceptual abstraction to the level of value, and abstract labor, understood as the specific form of value constituting activity, that alone enables a methodologically sound ascent from the abstract to the concrete, and thus a sufficient explanation of the more complex forms of wealth, regardless of whether this analysis is interpreted as historical or structural. In this respect, the execution of an analysis of the given, serves as the foundation for insight into its historical conditionedness, or as Marx puts it, the quote, anatomy of man is the key to the anatomy of the ape, end quote. According to the PKA, the specific representational problem now lies in grasping the capitalist mode of production in its historical specificity, as a given and self-reproducing whole. In this context, it is solely the assumption of the system's historical preconditions, those that, quote, could not yet have arisen from its own action as capital, end quote, that prevents a circular conception of the original self-positing of its own conditions. Yet reflection upon these limits of dialectical representation simultaneously assigns to it its legitimate sphere of validity within the analysis of bourgeois society, as it, quote, moves upon bourgeois society's own foundations, end quote. Holtzkamp's theory regarding the development of forms of wealth is also subject to criticism. Indeed, it is argued that Holtzkamp ultimately thereby stylizes, quote, the scientific method, into the cause of social progress, end quote. For without the former, understood as the emergence of complex economic relations, the latter would, according to Holtzkamp's premises, be inevitably entirely inconceivable. However, this, quote, logico-historical reading thereby fails to recognize the structure of the fundamental subject-object inversion characteristic of history to date. The positive exposition of the solution to the problem of presenting a system of mutually presupposing forms, specifically regarding the development from the commodity to money, corresponds to the treatment found in the PEM, political economy as a critical science, which is discussed in greater detail in chapter 1.32. So I guess that's it. That's what I've been saying is like part 1, chapter 3, section 2 of this study. At this juncture, however, we shall merely highlight the general methodological thesis of the PKA, political economy as a critical science, which posits that conceptual or, quote, logical development conceives of, quote, simple categories, such as the initial commodity or the simple form of value, as, quote, pure abstractions. It regards them as the exposition of non-empirical constitutive relations that are neither empirically perceivable as such nor exist in isolation as such, underlying empirically manifest forms of wealth, such as money, to which social actors consciously relate in the first instance. Thus, even if the initial commodity of Marx's capital is not, as it is in Engels, conceived of as pre-capitalist, but rather as an empirical capitalist commodity. This constitutes an empiricist fallacy. This fallacy finds its expression in the thesis first formulated by Wolfgang Fritz Haug in 1974, namely that the beginning of Marx's Capital is also a didactically elementary one, insofar as it commences with the, quote, gaze of the buying public, end quote, directed at commodities displayed in a shop window, a situation familiar to everyone. According to Haug, Marx's Capital therefore begins with, to quote Marx in a decontextualizing manner, quote, the commodity appearing in circulation, end quote. Marx's statement, however, is found in a contribution to the critique within the context of elucidating money's function as a medium of circulation, that is, on a completely different, more complex level of exposition than that of the beginning. Here Haug blurs the distinction between levels of abstraction in order to bolster his empiricist thesis. In contrast, according to the PKA, the reconstruction of the money form from the commodity form as a process that is not price determining and therefore not empirical proves to be, on the one hand, an acknowledgement of human beings' lack of awareness regarding the actual processes by which economic forms are constituted, and, on the other, a reconstruction of the practical unconscious generation of these forms by the actors themselves. Quote, the conscious pricing of the commodity is itself depicted as the result of hidden processes of social mediation. End quote. In doing so, and in opposition to Holtzkamp, the PKA emphasizes the constitutive role of the first two chapters of Marx's Capital as qualitatively distinct levels of abstraction within this exposition, representing the, quote, imagined versus the, quote, actual relation of commodities to one another, as well as the significance of the general equivalent as the necessary mode of existence for the value objectivity of commodities. All of this will be explored in detail in the chapters that follow. For the moment, however, it suffices to note that the PKA recognizes how the, quote, logico-historical, unquote, conception of dialectical exposition, when interpreted as an empiricist approach, correlates with the notion of forms of wealth as conscious products of human reflection. Conversely, it demonstrates that this same conception, when understood as a truly logical approach, constitutes the actual process of deciphering, the result of unconscious alienated socialization. The solution to the, quote, problem of presenting a finished totality, appearing in a mystified form, through analysis or abstraction, and the step-by-step development, end quote, of its categories. The study conducted by the Research Group on the Critique of Political Economy offers another example of neo-orthodox maneuvering between implicit criticism of Engels and an obvious tendency to spare Engels. To begin with, the study explicitly and unequivocally rejects any historicization, empiricization, or autonomization of the concepts that follow one another in the first three chapters of Marx's Capital. It argues that Marx adheres to Hegel's dictum, drawn from his philosophy of right, regarding the disparity between the, quote, order of the concept and the, quote, order of time, unquote. Like Hegel, Marx conceives of the progression of the exposition as a demonstration of the, quote, untruth and lack of independent existence of the, quote, abstract forms, end quote, found at the outset. In Marx's work, this methodological orientation is articulated as follows. The simple category, quote, can never exist except as an abstract, one-sided relation of an already given concrete living whole, end quote. Consequently, neither is value per se, quote, empirically graspable, end quote. Quote, it can only be thought, end quote. Nor should the, quote, most abstract determinations which Marx's Capital begins be conceived as autonomous social forms that historically preceded bourgeois society, end quote. Thus, simple categories are therefore not transformable, quote, into the autonomous and social formation of, quote, simple commodity production, end quote, end quote. Rather, the simple categories must be viewed as presupposition-laden entities situated against the backdrop of the, quote, entire system of bourgeois production, end quote. Furthermore, even the ascent from the core structure to the surface, a movement Marx executes from the first to the third volume, never reaches the level of actual historical empiria, but merely attains the, quote, surface configurations in general, end quote, that characterize every actual capitalist system. However, Hegel's and Engels' parallels between historical and conceptual development are also cited. Yet the, quote, difference in their views, noted in this context vis-a-vis Marx, is said to be explicable, quote, by the very object of their inquiry, end quote. While the former were concerned with the, quote, overall historical process, end quote, the latter focused solely on the structure of the capitalist mode of production. Were this assertion accurate, the project group would be compelled to accept, albeit without attributing to its creator, Engels' theory of simple commodity production, which they had just criticized, along with all its concretistic implications regarding abstract labor and value. Furthermore, they would have to revert to viewing the opening chapters of Marx's Capital as an ideal typical historical model. An elaborate analysis of Marx's mode of presentation can be found 1 year after the Holzkamp PKA controversy, in a contribution by an author collective led by Veit Michael Bader, Heiner Gansmann, and others. In it, they advanced the strong thesis that Marx's Capital represents a new, quote, form of scientific comprehension distinct from the conventional understanding of the procedures of the positive sciences, end quote. End quote. Yet, precisely this thesis regarding its specificity and difference vis-a-vis the deductively nomological method of the empirical sciences remains unsubstantiated. While they acknowledge that their concept of the logical method of the critique of political economy, quote, must be demarcated from the formal logical deduction, end quote, they state that this, quote, cannot be further elaborated upon here, end quote. Despite this glaring discrepancy between programmatic ambition and meta-theoretical explication, Bader and his co-authors do, in fact, provide a precise definition of the concept of logical systematic presentation. The objects of dialectical exposition in the critique of political economy are therefore, quote, structure of an empirical totality, end quote. The, quote, existence of the capitalist mode of production, as well as its, quote, structure, condition, developmental tendencies, end quote. Its internal historicity. The, quote, development of the forms of social wealth is understood here not as the reconstruction of their historical genesis, but rather as the explanation of the structure of simultaneously existing forms. Dialectical exposition is primarily the conceptual reproduction of a constituted and constantly reconstituting object which, as a system of mutual presuppositions and interdependencies among its constituent moments, already exists in reality, quote, in itself, yet which, quote, for us, as a conceptually grasped entity, still requires development. For this conceptual development, there arises a necessity for a, quote, sequential order in the opposition, end quote. Pragmatically, there exists an impossibility of linguistically reproducing forms that exist simultaneously in reality with equal simultaneity. In terms of content, there exists more fundamental overarching determinations within the web of reciprocal dependencies, as well as a distinction between invisible real interconnections, or processes of constitution, and the empirical appearance of these same phenomena. To designate such synchronous interconnections, the category of, quote, contemporary history, end quote, employed by Marx himself and subsequently adopted by the PKA, is criticized as misleading. The critique of political economy contains statements regarding historical trajectories within the framework of the analysis of the capitalist mode of production, exclusively from a structure-induced perspective, that is, in the sense of what Jürgen Ritzert in 1973 termed the, quote, internal historicity, end quote, of the system. These statements are to be distinguished as statements concerning the dimension of, quote, conceptual necessity, end quote, from statements regarding empirically real historical processes. This dimension presupposes synchronic analysis because it addresses only dynamics that are structurally determined, that is, those stemming from the general formal determinations of capital, and takes as its subject neither contingent historical developments that cannot be derived therefrom, nor, quote, external historicity, end quote. That is, the emergence of the historical preconditions of capital. Such historical accounts would be introduced once the limits of dialectical structural analysis have been reached. In accordance with these specifications by Bader et al., dialectical exposition can therefore be initially defined as an explanation, a, quote, development for us, end quote, of a structure comprising simultaneous, interdependent, and interactive forms of social wealth, taking into account both the existence of overarching determinations, hierarchized interdependencies, and the distinction between real, yet not immediately empirically graspable, processes of constitution and interconnections, on the one hand, and their inverted empirical mode of appearance on the other. Bader et al. Too, however, aspire to be neo-orthodox. While they do criticize Engels more explicitly than Bischoff and the PEM do, arguing that Marx, in the book Capital, is concerned, quote, initially, bracket question mark, and bracket, end quote, with discovering an internal law-governed connection within historical development, parenthesis, as Engels claims, in parenthesis. To me. Let me repeat that sentence, I fucked it up. While they do criticize Engels more explicitly than Bischoff and the PEM do, arguing that Marx in the book Capital is concerned, quote, initially, end quote, not with discovering an internal, law-governed connection within historical development, as Engels claims, but rather with the laws, the quote, essential structure, end quote, of capitalism, they nevertheless cannot bring themselves to clearly articulate the fundamental differences separating them from Marx. They suggest that in Engels' work, the distinction between conceptual and historical development is formulated, quote, ambiguously, end quote, and that regarding the question of the historical existence of simple forms, Marx argues, quote, with greater nuance than Engels, yet in the same fundamental direction, end quote. Moreover, the concept of contradiction, which according to the authors is meant to designate nothing less than the very engine of conceptual development within the framework of a dialectical exposition, remains completely underdeveloped. The mere half-page devoted to the conception of contradiction contains 3 assertions. The first 2 remain unexplained, but the third is logically problematic. First, they claim that the principle of dialectical contradiction development consists in the elaboration of forms of motion of internal contradictions, mediated through their external representation. Second, they assert that these contradictions are to be found on both the theoretical and the social levels simultaneously, thereby serving as mechanisms for both conceptual and historical development. Third, and consequently, contradictions in thought are presented as the results of real social contradictions, rather than the reverse, real contradictions being the products of theoretical projection, quote, into a reality that is inherently harmonious, end quote. Since the concept of contradiction is not elucidated, even in the most rudimentary fashion, and given that their rejection of the, quote, projection thesis, end quote, is directed against Werner Becker's critique of the assumption that logical contradictions exist in reality, the authors appear to conflate a, quote, logically non-contradictory, end quote, understanding of reality with one that is, quote, conflict-free and harmonious, end quote. The recognition of logical contradictions in reality would thus be an indicator of a critical social theory. The collective of authors places particular emphasis on the immanent character of the exposition. Value is thereby defined as the analytically derived synthetic starting point of the exposition. It is held to be the highest abstraction, the abstract general of a specific mode of production. The level of abstraction of this starting point is, accordingly, delimited by formal analysis. The task of the critique of political economy is not to highlight criteria common to all modes of production, but rather to investigate, quote, the specific forms of the production of the bourgeois wealth, end quote. The material content of production and its products is taken into account within formal analysis only, quote, when it is modified by the formal relations, or appears as modifying them, end quote. Conversely, abstracting even from the formal determinacy of the product, that is, from its historically specific role in the socialization of labor, would lead outside the capitalist mode of production toward transhistorical determinations such as, quote, good, or, quote, production in general, end quote. Quote, the level of abstraction of the starting point must therefore not be set too high, end quote. On the other hand, however, it, quote, must not be set too low, end quote, either, for it must encompass the simplest and most general category, quote, the prerequisite for the formation of all further concepts of this specifically historical form of production, end quote, and is therefore contained within all more complex and concrete categories. Synthetic development is thus defined as strictly immanent, as the, quote, development of the formal determinations of the same content, end quote, which content is in turn a socially typical form of value. In this respect, according to Bader et al., and contrary to Althusser, the starting point is neither a diffuse, quote, certain complexity, nor a, quote, freely chosen, or, quote, exclusively theoretical, end quote, contingency. The subsequent progression of the exposition, however, modifies the concept of the starting point. It reveals itself to be at once necessary and mediated, underdetermined and dependent upon the more complex forms. The commodity, by contrast, constitutes the analytical starting point of the exposition. According to Bader et al., the progression from their determinations as use value and exchange value to immanent value is in fact an analytical movement. Alongside Hans-Georg Backhaus, whose contribution, uniquely interlinking methodological and object-related dimensions, will be the subject of the following chapter, it was primarily Heinz-Dieter Kittsteiner who, in the 1970s, articulated the, quote, differences between the Marxian and Engelsian systems of science, end quote, in the context of a critique of political economy with a clarity hitherto entirely lacking. Kittsteiner attributes the fact that the, quote, problematization of the theoretical relationship between Marx and Engels, end quote, met with, quote, unanimous resistance, end quote, within actually existing socialism to certain political implications of the logico-historical approach, implications that remain to be discussed. Yet even weighty contributions to the, quote, recent reception of Marx, end quote, works that for the first time conceived of Marx's Capital as a logico-systemic analysis, were characterized by their failure to take a, quote, clear stance on the subject of Marx versus Engels, as per the critique leveled against Bader et al., or even by their attempt, as in the case of Bischoff, to effect a, quote, hasty reconciliation between the two. According to Kittsteiner, the review, which Engels wrote in 1859 on the occasion of the publication of Marx's A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, and which has been stylized in the ML as a brilliant methodological commentary, reveals itself, when viewed in light of the correspondence between Marx and Engels, to be an even more historically contingent, quote, stopgap, unquote, measure than anteduring. In this correspondence, Marx presses Engels to write a review, prompted by the fact that his work was being completely ignored in the specialist literature, a task Engels undertakes only hesitantly while emphasizing his own lack of expertise. In doing so, Engels fails to address, even in a single word, the two substantive points Marx had urged him to cover, the critique of Proudhon and the demonstration of value as a specifically social form of the capitalist mode of production. However, he does at least conceive of the critique of political economy as a scientific system of bourgeois wealth, as a, quote, coherent development of the laws of bourgeois production and bourgeois exchange, end quote, and, by extension, as a critique of the economic literature that serves to legitimize these very laws. However, according to Kittsteiner, the understanding of science as a system, which both Marx and Engels derived through a critical engagement with Hegel, diverges significantly between the two due to, quote, their differing relationships to Hegelian philosophy, end quote. Kittsteiner. Marx's relationship to Hegel is characterized by two steps of demystification. In his first demystification, Marx formulates a nominalist critique of the hypostatization of abstractions and of the conception of concrete properties as manifestations of these abstractions. He unmasks the inversion of the determining element, subject, human being, species, the concrete empirical civil society, and the determined element, object, spirit, the abstract ideal, the universalist claim of the state as an idealist illusion, and reverses it. In contrast to this discourse regarding illusory inversion, Marx now formulates, within the framework of his critique of political economy, a, quote, deciphering of the, quote, mystified problem of a, quote, objectification, end quote, unquote, Marx, of the abstract universal. Marx thereby conceives of the subject-object inversion as a historically specific phenomenon and as a theorization of a real empirical content. This line of critique against Hegel, already foreshadowed in The German Ideology, simultaneously interprets the categories of the philosophy of history, in which, quote, empirical reality, becomes the form for the realization of a teleologically determined idea, end quote, as a mystification of the capitalist process. This connection is now seen as being particularly illuminated in the first edition of Marx's Capital, where one finds a meta-theoretical trace of Marx's engagement with Hegel, a trace that Marx subsequently expunged from later editions. In order to elucidate the specific nature of economic objectivity within the expression of value, Marx posits that this expression involves a genuine, quote, inversion, whereby the sensuously concrete counts merely as a form of appearance of the abstract general, rather than conversely, the abstract general counting as a property of the concrete. If I say Roman law and German law are both laws, that is self-evident. If, however, I say law, this abstraction realizes itself in Roman law and in German law, these concrete laws, then the connection becomes mystical. End quote. Marx. Taken together with the observation that, quote, only the Hegelian, quote, concept manages to objectify itself without external matter, end quote. This is seen as signaling Marx's transformation of a speculative genesis of forms into a scientifically ascertainable one, the material object serving as the representational vehicle for value, as well as the, quote, general principle manifesting within that object, must be understood as the result of the dual character of human labor operating under historically specific conditions. The former constitutes the objectification of labor within natural matter. This latter constitutes a, quote, objectification in which, quote, not a mystical subject, but rather a specific form of social interconnection concretizes itself. In Kittsteiner's analysis, this inversion of the predicate into the subject is also characterized as a mystification, quote, of reality itself, end quote. This characterization is, however, potentially misleading, insofar as this inversion does not imply that the use value, the medium in which the, quote, general manifests itself, actually becomes value, or that it somehow emerges from it. Indeed, Kittsteiner ultimately points out that notwithstanding this reversal of his earlier critique of Hegel, Marx, quote, did not become a mystifier in Das Kapital, end quote. For Marx, the concern is a, quote, rational theory of the incarnation of a real, quote, abstract universal, end quote, end quote. However, as a social relation between human beings, this is now mediated through objects and withdrawn from the control of the actors, thereby also constituting a rational determination of the human non-human constituent of history in contrast to traditional philosophies of history. Quote, value substance is, in the strict sense, not a human, but a non-human, asocial substance of history, in contrast to the activity of the capital C concept and the capital C concept's objectification. This objectification of a social substance is not, in its forms, pre-secured in favor of any specific goal of history. The act of recognizing it, therefore, does not strip history of its alien character. End quote. According to Kittsteiner, such a, quote, materialist realization of the idealist concept of the system, end quote, can only take place as a, quote, science of social forms, end quote. Quote, for only its sphere of inquiry is conceivable as the product of abstract general human labor, end quote. Its task is, therefore, to explain both the genesis and the interconnection of the abstract and the concrete, of value and price, for instance, and is defined by Marx as the, quote, genetic development, end quote, of reified forms of wealth. However, if Hegel's dialectical system of science is nothing other than the, quote, methodological form of a philosophical historical project, to represent the world as an inherently meaningful totality, end quote, even though it does not obey the finite reason of individuals, then according to Kittsteiner, the disregard for Marx's deciphering of this system must inevitably lead to a different conception of science. This, he argues, is precisely what occurred in the case of Engels. While Engels too speaks of dialectical science, in contrast to a, quote, metaphysically isolating mode of observation, as the uncovering of the internal interconnections of its subject matter, Engels does not, however, ground this understanding in the specifically social form of labor. Engels remains within the framework of a nominalist critique of Engels remains within the framework of a nominalist critique of Hegel, one incapable of explaining either the idealist form of Hegel's philosophy, specifically the dominance of the, quote, universal, conceived as a, quote, subject, or the nature of dialectic as a, quote, method, intrinsically linked to Hegel's system. Consequently, Engels constructs an empiricist model of science that purports to proceed from the, quote, most stubborn facts, end quote, from the world, quote, as it presents itself to anyone who approaches it without preconceived idealist whims, end quote, in order to subsequently bring these, quote, materialistically registered facts into some form of order. Engels thus places theory and empiricism in a relationship of reflection, one that permits the grasp of neither the original object of the critique, the book, real abstraction as a non-intuitive, comprehensive nexus of private labors, nor its conceptual apprehension, parenthesis, as the establishment of a connection between the abstract and the concrete, end parenthesis. The inversion of Hegelian philosophy, based on a correspondence theory of representation, thereby also underpins Engels' thesis regarding the parallelism of the, quote, logical and the, quote, historical. For him, a theoretical exposition lacking a direct empirical correlate is inconceivable, a point intended to be substantiated by his remarks on Marx's method of presentation and theory of money in their correspondence of 1858. Yet Marx himself in the years 1857 to 58 still struggled to disentangle logical and historical analysis, as evidenced by his remark regarding the need to grasp the, quote, transition of landed property into wage labor, not merely dialectically but historically, end quote. Nevertheless, this juxtaposition of, quote, dialectical and, quote, historical points to Marx's clear awareness of the logically systematic character of dialectical exposition. The simultaneous consideration of the totality's, quote, becoming and its, quote, having become, which Kittsteiner identifies in several passages of the Grundrisse, is regarded by him as the consequence of a movement from the abstract to the concrete that, while methodologically postulated, had not yet been substantively realized. This implicitly contradicts Backhaus's thesis, which remains to be examined, regarding an increasing, quote, historicization of the logical, end quote, in the development of Marx's work, from the Grundrisse to the second edition of Marx's Capital. Nevertheless, according to Kittsteiner, Marx begins to establish a methodological distinction between a logically formed genetic perspective and a historical perspective as early as the 1857 introduction. Marx's critique of Hegel, specifically Hegel's tendency to, quote, conceive the real as the result of thinking that concentrates itself within itself, deepens itself within itself, and moves out of itself, end quote, signifies, according to Kittsteiner, that, quote, the real, in its internal coherence, is constituted not by a mystical subject, but by a specific mode of the expenditure of social labor, end quote. In other words, the, quote, essence is not itself, capital R, reason. According to Kittsteiner, Marx's central critique of Hegel is thus not that Hegel derives reality from the idea, but rather that Hegel admits no principle of mediation other than a conceptual one, thereby positing reason, capital R, reason, as both the form and the content of knowledge simultaneously. Quote, the movement of the categories thus becomes, at the same time, an act of production, not of empirical reality, but rather of its internal coherence, constructed as, quote, rational, end quote, end quote. The determination of the difference between the abstract, conceived as a, quote, real abstraction, inherent in labor, and its conceptual reproduction, that is, between the real object and the object of knowledge, also leads Marx to fundamentally question the unity of the logical and the historical. He now regards it as, quote, infeasible and incorrect, end quote, to make the historical sequence of economic forms the basis of his analysis of capitalism. Quote, a, quote, system, in the strict sense, can only ever be the development of forms that have already come into being, proceeding from a constitutive principle, never, however, the history of the coming into being, of that system, end quote. For Marx, this state of affairs becomes clarified through his engagement with the subject matter itself, unfolding throughout the Grundrisse and culminating in the Urtext, in an acknowledgement of the limits of dialectical exposition, specifically in light of the fact that the separation of immediate producers from the means of production must be presupposed in order to explain the capitalist mode of production. According to Kittsteiner, Engel's review is therefore burdened by a, quote, double encumbrance. He relies on statements made by Marx in their correspondence of 1858, in which synchronic and diachronic transitions are even more tightly intertwined, and moreover interprets, a contribution to the critique against the backdrop of his own nominalist critique of Hegel. Engels' central question, Kittsteiner argues, is whether the theoretical history of political economy can serve as a guide for the conceptual development of political economy's critique. According to Kittsteiner, Marx would initially answer this in the affirmative, in the sense that the historical unfolding of the contradictions of capitalism drives their conceptual processing into logical contradictions which, by means of theoretical critique, can serve as the starting point for the elaboration of a systematic analysis within the critique of political economy. Quote, in this sense, the form genetic exposition ... is based on the historical development of bourgeois theory. End quote. However, Engels posits a mirror image relationship between real historical and theoretical historical development, moving, quote, from the simplest to the most complex relations, end quote, and therefore believes he can presuppose a potential point of connection with the literature of political economy. Yet, Kittsteiner argues, this thesis is inaccurate even as a merely descriptive statement regarding the history of economic thought. The history of economic thought, rather, moves from complex to simple categories. If, however, Engels nonetheless deems the, quote, logical method of treatment, end quote, to be the only appropriate one, then his concept of the, quote, logical, conceived as a reflection of the, quote, lawful developmental nexus of empirical history, end quote, remains fundamentally at odds with that of Marx. In advancing such a thesis of parallelism, Engels could initially draw upon Hegel's History of Philosophy, or the book History of Philosophy. For both, after all, quote, ascend from simple being to the concept determined within itself, unquote. According to Hegel, however, the intermingling of the essential and the non-essential within the concrete manifestations of philosophy can only be disentangled if a knowledge of the essence is already at hand. Quote, the, quote, concept of philosophy and its, quote, history stand ... in relation to one another as a horizontal and vertical system. The vertical ... is the derived one. History grasped conceptually is always a construction in which the, quote, essential is singled out from the manifoldness of the empirically historical, end quote. History, therefore, contrary to what Engels still believed, by no means itself provides the criteria for the theoretical structuring of that history. Thus, even for Hegel, the history of philosophy is by no means the key to grasping philosophy as a system. This methodological insight, so Kittsteiner argues, yields contradictory consequences within Hegel's philosophy of right and philosophy of history, namely a complete disparity between the knowledge of essence and historical narration, and between the logical and historical sequence of categories. The philosophy of right, conceived as a, quote, horizontal system of forms that have come into being, end quote, the interconnections of which, according to Hegel, by no means reflect their historical order, is epistemologically prior to the philosophy of history. The philosophy of history constitutes merely a, quote, system of the second order, dependent upon Hegel's concept of civil society, end quote. This, Kittsteiner concludes, serves as the methodological model for Marx's approach in Capital, albeit in a manner that reflects the limits of dialectical exposition, identifying the historical element both within the logical categories themselves and the systemic interconnections they capture, and in terms of their dependence upon specific presuppositions or limitations. According to Kittsteiner, Marx's form genetic exposition exhibits various, quote, historical implications, in a sense quite different from that asserted by the logico-historical orthodoxy. Accordingly, form analysis is firstly a historicizing type of theory because it explains value and value forms as arising from, albeit given, historically specific conditions of the socialization of labor. Its object is not, strictly speaking, a historical process of becoming, but rather something that has already become in a historical social sense, something non-natural and non-eternal. Secondly, the resultant system of economic forms possesses an imminent, quote, direction of development, end quote. Specifically, the structurally conditioned historical dynamics of the development of productive forces, the falling rate of profit, etc., as cited by Bader et al., or it might be termed its inner historicity. Thirdly, the historical element conceived as something antecedent to the system of the capitalist mode of production, and thus not directly subject to the explanation of that system, serves as the external boundary of form analysis, the, quote, external historicity, end quote, of capital. In this context, Kit Steiner, one of the few interpreters to do so, recognizes that the limits of dialectical exposition in Marx's Capital are rigorously grounded in the vicious circle into which any explanation would inevitably fall, were it not to presuppose that the initial conditions of production for the capitalist mode of production, monetary wealth and free labor power, cannot themselves be results of capital. Finally, a further fourth significance of the historical element, one that serves to delimit form analysis, lies in the historical as the, quote, empirical factual, end quote. For instance, the, quote, real movement of competition, end quote, mentioned by Marx, the sphere of singular events within the historical process, which lies beyond Marx's examination of the, quote, ideal surface of capital and necessitates a separate investigation into, quote, empirically given circumstances, end quote. In this context, a few years later, Kit Steiner distinguishes various semantic nuances of, quote, form, or respectively the suffix, quote, mode, as in Produktionsweise, which I don't know why it's not translated, but I don't know if that's mode of production, within the critique of political economy. Thus, the concept of a, quote, mode of production is said to be employed in a dual sense. Firstly, as the, quote, manner and method of working upon nature, end quote, understood in terms of an industrial artisanal type of production. Secondly, with regard to a, quote, specifically social form of its product, end quote, conceived as the specific nature of the wealth order within a particular social totality. With this, one enters the, quote, form genetic discourse, end quote, which grasps forms as historically specific economic objectives, as modes of existence of the dual character of labor under capitalism. While, quote, form here denotes a material configuration of the social character of labor that is specific to a particular social formation, the term, quote, form is precisely within the concept of, quote, social formation, end quote, itself, to be found in a, quote, broader sense, end quote, namely as a specific manner of organizing, quote, fundamental relations, ... that are common to several societies, end quote. Examples include relations of domination and servitude, as when reference is made to a, quote, change in the form of servitude, end quote. or the imperative towards socialization inherent in the division of labor, as when speaking of the, quote, specifically social character, end quote, of labor, or finally the appropriation of surplus labor, as when citing the typical mode of appropriation that serves to distinguish one social formation from another. Ultimately, the concept of, quote, formation, understood as a geological category, quote, such as rock formation, metaphorically transposed onto the social realm, points toward relations of superimposition and determination existing between the, quote, strata and planes, end quote, of a given epoch. Kitzsteiner also highlights the object theoretical implications of the historicist interpretation of dialectics in Engels' thought, namely the pragmatic derivation of money, the interpretation of the first 3 chapters of Marx's Capital as a theory of simple commodity production, and the historicizing reading of the inversion of the law of appropriation, as well as their political implications. He begins by aptly describing Marx's formal analysis of money as an explanation of the, quote, systematically necessary unity of commodity and money under developed capitalist conditions, end quote. It is only on the basis of such an analysis of the essence of money, whose undeveloped categories correspond to, quote, no historical form whatsoever, end quote, that perspectives for a historical investigation of its development emerge. Engels, and following in his footsteps, Holtzkamp, invert this relationship, thereby arriving at a technical concept of money that conceives of it exclusively as a means to facilitate the circulation of temporally presupposed, quote, simple economic forms, commodities, while obscuring its internal connection with these forms. According to Kitzsteiner, Marx's critique of political economy, that it, quote, derives money from the external difficulties, end quote, of, quote, simple barter, end quote, and thus systematically fails to grasp it as an economic object. According to Kitzsteiner, Marx's critique of political economy, that it, quote, derives money from the external difficulties, end quote, of, quote, simple barter, and thus systematically fails to grasp it as an economic object, therefore applies to Engels as well. Kitzsteiner now identifies a dual legitimizing function of the Engels paradigm for actually existing socialism. While the first of these functions, as elucidated by Western Marxism, draws upon the dialectics of nature, which, quote, viewed natural processes as a test, a, quote, test for a specific trajectory of the historical process, end quote, and therefore demanded the proletariat subordination to iron economic necessities. The second, he argues, stems from Engels' conception of method, mediated through his historical interpretation of the conversion of the law of appropriation. This second function serves to legitimize the ideology of, quote, socialist commodity production, end quote. Within Marx's Capital, this, quote, conversion is situated within the discussion regarding the capitalization of surplus value. While the, quote, original transformation of money into capital takes place in accordance with the laws of appropriation governing commodity exchange, yet entails an asymmetrical exploitative production relationship, the subsequent process of accumulation now sees labor power remunerated with a portion of its own surplus labor, which had previously been appropriated gratuitously by the capitalist. This capitalization of surplus value occurs in full conformity with the principle of equivalence. The fact that surplus value now serves in part as the wage fund for variable capital in no way alters the fact that this surplus value constitutes the legitimate property of the capitalist, having arisen from the payment of the, quote, just price for labor power, and now serves in turn to pay that, quote, just price once again, thereby facilitating the renewed extraction of surplus value. Marx somewhat misleadingly refers to this as a, quote, reversal, a, quote, upheaval of the laws of appropriation governing commodity exchange. However, this does not signify a violation of these laws by the process of expanded reproduction of capital. Marx repeatedly distanced himself from positions prevalent within the socialist movement, such as that of Proudhon, which seek to, quote, abolish capitalist private property, quote, abolish capitalist property, and, quote, by, quote, asserting against it the eternal laws of property inherent in commodity production, end quote. Furthermore, as Kitzsteiner has now demonstrated, Marx in no way posits a historical development leading from a non-exploitative system of, quote, simple commodity production to exploitative capitalism. Rather, in this context, quote, reversal signifies, on the one hand, the systematic implication of exploitation and the lack of freedom for immediate producers within an order of universalized commodity exchange, a relationship that, for expository purposes, is analyzed sequentially. Finally, moreover, quote, reversal denotes the conceptual deconstruction of the notion, derived from the sphere of circulation, that property is founded upon one's own labor. It constitutes the demonstration that this notion can arise only on the basis of a mode of production that establishes private property in the means of production as a legal title to unpaid labor. Engels, however, in the book Anti-Düring, interprets this, quote, reversal as a historical development leading from simple commodity production to capitalism. Remarkably, and here again following Bachhaus, it is Kitzsteiner who clearly identifies Engels as the originator of this thesis. The PKA, bracket, Marx-Engels Gesamtausgabe, and bracket, by contrast, makes no mention whatsoever. I don't know if this is a bad translation or what. Hold on. This is a weird thing. Let me. That sentence doesn't make sense. Translating again, it says the PKA, by contrast, for instance, in his detailed critique of Karl Kautsky's historicist commentary on Marx's Capital, is not mentioned. Yeah, it's a weird sentence. Let me see if I can make this work. The translation, it says, the PKA, by contrast, for instance, in his detailed critique of Karl Kautsky's historicist commentary on Capital, which also takes issue with Kautsky's interpretation of the inversion of the law of appropriation, is not mentioned by Engels at a single word. Again, I don't know why the initial translation is so bad. Anyway, so what I'm getting out of that sentence, which may or may not be the case, again, take this whole translation with a decent degree of caution, but is that there must have been some popularization by Kautsky that had this kind of historicist commentary. Had this kind of historicist commentary about the transition from simple commodity production to capitalist mode of production. That apparently Engels didn't Engels critiqued it, but then applied it. Is that what I'm getting out of it? I don't know. According to Kittsteiner, I have no idea, so take what I say with a grain of salt. I view that as a smudge on the translation. According to Kittsteiner, Engels' concept of the fundamental contradiction characterizing capitalism, that between social production and private appropriation, derives from this theorem, which is subsequently taken up by authors of, quote, real socialism. According to Engels, the simple commodity production of isolated small-scale producers is displaced by the, quote, social production, end quote, of capitalist enterprises, a production characterized by a higher level of productivity made possible through the internal division of labor. However, Kittsteiner argues that this, quote, sociality is a quality posited by capital itself, and is not to be confused with a quote, directly social expenditure of labor, end quote, occurring at the level of the societal division of labor. Yet this very conflation gradually emerges in Engels' work as he historically juxtaposes, quote, social production, the fact that within the capitalist enterprise, means of production can only be utilized collectively, and production processes are broken down into minute details, thereby becoming mutually interdependent, against, quote, private appropriation, end quote. The private and exclusive appropriation of surplus labor thus appears to Engels as a, quote, historical relic, end quote, from the epoch of, quote, simple commodity production, end quote. That is, as a property relation appropriate only to a mode of production in which the means of production and the products constitute the objects, the instruments, and results of the private, the owned the labor, result of the small-scale producer's own labor. According to Kittsteiner, this lays the foundation for an artificial separation of the mode of production and the mode of appropriation, a separation that presupposes that capitalism at the level of the social division of labor already organizes production in a directly planned manner, that this production merely needs to be detached from the legal, quote, shell of private property and politically repurposed. Here, anticipating the views of Moishe Pistone, the dual character of labor, as the, quote, actual fundamental contradiction of capitalism, end quote, vanishes completely from view. The mobilization of labor power and its combination with the means of production are no longer understood as an act of capital, and the private character of the social division of labor is overlooked. In short, quote, social production, quote, loses its defining characteristic of being determined by the capital relation, end quote. The semi-official political economy of Marxism-Leninism now latches on to this constellation, which while simultaneously modifying it in the direction of a theory of originally socialist commodity production. Social production, which is to be adopted from capitalism without further ado, can, according to the Engels exegete Leontiev, indeed be, quote, organized among commodity economic lines, end quote. The resolution of the, quote, fundamental contradiction, end quote, interpreted in this manner, then consists solely in replacing private appropriation with communal appropriation of this, quote, social labor organized along commodity economic lines, end quote. Whereas Engels still spoke somewhat diffusely of the, quote, mode of production, end quote, as being, quote, whereas Engels still spoke somewhat diffusely of the, quote, mode of production, end quote, as being already directly socially organized, and thus socialist. Here, in contrast to Engels, both commodities and money are posited as elements of the immediate socialization of labor. Thereby, Marx's critique of political economy is reduced to absurdity, and the conceptual framework of, quote, real socialism is senselessly retrofitted onto it. Consequently, for this, quote, socialist political economy, quote, concrete and abstract labor are regarded as, quote, forms of appearance of immediately social labor, end quote, and the law of value as a neutral, quote, instrument for the control and execution of tasks prescribed by the plan. According to Kitzsteiner, the dual character of labor, which, quote, specifically implies that social labor is expended not immediately, but privately, is thus, quote, reinterpreted as a form of appearance of immediately social labor, end quote. Thus, instead of asking whether the continued existence of commodities and money in the Eastern Bloc has anything to do with their specifically indirect socialization of labor and the production relations underlying it, all currently existing categories are simply, quote, stamped with the predicate of, quote, socialism, end quote, unquote, by invoking the resolution of a supposedly, quote, fundamental contradiction, end quote. The critical approach to a, quote, adjectival, like adjective-esque, or adjectival, I guess is how you say it. The critical approach to a, quote, adjectival concept of socialism was further deepened throughout the 1980s and 1990s, and the connection between Engels as well as Marx's statements and the theory of socialist commodity production came to be viewed even more closely. And this is something that, even though this book's mostly about Marx's critique of political economy, right? Oh, and like the theoretical history of it. The similar book that I've mentioned a number of times, probably more than a number of times, or ought to have mentioned a number of times, Jan Hoff's book, Marx Worldwide, talks about how very similar, I don't think he draws the parallel, actually, between the German debates and the Japanese debates, but he talks about precisely like certain authors within Japan in the 1950s were talking critically about this, the conception that like the law of value was somehow compatible with socialism or something like that, like as like put forward by the Economic Problems of Socialism by Stalin, written in like I think in the late 40s, early 50s, kind of close to when he died. But the idea, like having like a way more like critical or discerning view about the role of commodity production within a post-capitalist society, which seems like it should be fairly, which doesn't seem like it should have taken to the 1980s and 1990s for this to have been critically scrutinized by Marx scholars. But like even like back in the day, right, the idea that the USSR was state capitalist was fundamentally on the basis that like the working class was exploited, and therefore in the USSR, and therefore it was capitalist, as opposed to like kind of any like too particularly deep analysis of the role of, say, the role of buying and selling of commodities was very was not something that was included in most left-wing critiques of the Soviet system. that would take people who would later do that would be like Amadeu Bordiga, for instance, the can't think of his name, Shirley Bettelheim, and then Press Chattopadhyay in like would be some people who would kind of like criticize, would say that like use the critique of political economy, or at least like to use the concept of like commodity, the concept of the commodity would be essential in their analysis of the Soviet economy and the economies of the Eastern Bloc. But that was kind of like a later development, right? And they were kind of like one-off things. But like also in Japan, there was people in the 1950s who were like criticizing Stalinism and the Soviet economy for using the concepts of Marx's capital to point to the capitalist nature of the Soviet economy, which is really interesting. It's really interesting how like very interesting how vanguard like Japan was in these things, especially like the how much they beat other scholars across the globe to certain theoretical conclusions, right? I think one of the most brilliant people that I don't know, I shouldn't say such broad things, but never mind. But definitely check out some of the work by Samiza Kuruma, for instance, and for some like very like insightful readings of the critique of political economy, particularly the book Genesis of Money, which is put out by Brill and later Haymarket. Anyway, moving on. Some clarifications regarding the reflection of the historical within the framework of logical systemic exposition, as well as the problematic nature of its presuppositions, can be found in Ulrich Müller's 1977 dissertation titled Form und Geschichte, which I think is Form and History. Müller argues against identifying the demonstration of the historicity of the object of the critique of political economy with the theoretical reconstruction of its historical genesis. According to Ulrich Müller, the, quote, actual historical character of Marxian science, and quote, remains, quote, unilluminated, end quote, in the works of Engels or Lenin, who are cited as prominent representatives of this misinterpretation. In addition to the problems of the historicizing reading considered thus far, Müller identifies the further danger of a philosophical, historical overestimation of this approach. If the exposition in Marx's Capital is understood as a reconstruction of the historical emergence of capitalist production out of, quote, simple commodity production, that is, that the former is, quote, derived from the latter, then this approach, which is flawed in itself, could generally be, quote, transferred to the transition of earlier historical social formations into later ones, end quote, thereby transforming itself into a model of the law-governed succession of modes of production. Consequently, the object of Marx's Capital, quote, the economic law of motion of modern society, end quote, understood as the, quote, determining ground of processes unfolding as systematic and self-developing repetitions, end quote, is reinterpreted as the mechanics of motion of a, quote, teleologically conceived world whole, end quote, established by, quote, supra-historical universal laws, end quote. The epoch-specific law of the capitalist mode of production is thus elevated to a universal law of history per se, an assumption shared by, quote, opponents of Marxism and, quote, many Marxists, and, quote, alike, yet one that was clearly rejected by Marx himself. The object of Marx's capital is thus a historically specific context of reproduction characterized by the continuous self-expanding transformation of presupposition into result and result into presupposition. In this process, the circularity of the object is conceptually reproduced within the framework of a circular mode of exposition. However, a materialist exposition of the capitalist system must take into account that it is a context that works its way forward from pre-existing presuppositions to self-generating results which are ultimately bent back into presuppositions. The incorporation of empirical presuppositions, those not originally posited by the system itself, is therefore a constitutive element of a materialist reflection on the systematic nature of the object, or the systemic nature of the object. At the same time, this proves to be a methodologically integrated acknowledgement embedded within the expository framework of the systems having come into being. The socially specific historicity of forms of wealth is thus grasped not through an analysis of their becoming, but through the acknowledgement of their having come into being, an acknowledgement achieved within the context of the system's unfolding. As Marx puts it, quote, "It is not necessary in order to develop the laws of bourgeois economy to write the actual history of the relations of production, but the correct view and deduction of these relations as relations that have themselves historically come into being always leads back to, quote, first equations," unquote, which point to a past lying behind this system, end quote. Marx. However, unlike Mueller, not all presuppositions regarding the system's genesis need be taken into account during the course of its conceptual development. However, according to Mueller, not all presuppositions. Repeat that sentence, I fucked it up. However, according to Mueller, not all presuppositions regarding the system's genesis need be taken into account during the course of its conceptual development. A distinction must be drawn between contingent and systematically constitutive presuppositions. Systematic presuppositions are characterized by two features. They are not conditions that vanish, but rather conditions that are reproduced as results, conditions indispensable to the systemic context, which must be continually regenerated to ensure that the process of capital does not grind to a halt. Consequently, the first contingent type is represented by phenomena such as the potential self-accumulation of capitalist monetary wealth or the rural exodus of serfs. Such phenomena did not recur under capitalism and are not considered decisive determinants. Furthermore, there exist preconditions that, while reproduced, are not constitutive of the capital form, such as merchant or interest-bearing capital. The constitutive preconditions of capital itself, those reproduced by capital, are identified primarily in the commodity form per se and in the commodity character of labor power. However, as constitutive elements, they must not merely be included empirically in the exposition. Within that framework, they must also be derived anew as necessary results, specifically the commodity as well as labor power, separated from its conditions of realization and thus appearing as a commodity, or to be derived as products of capital. It is only in the course of the subsequent exposition that the integration of external and initially underivable moments is thereby legitimized. Quote, if, a systematic condition of capitalist production is at issue, then this condition is dependent upon the reproduction of that production in order to avoid ceasing to exist. The exposition, must therefore derive this precondition as a necessary result, end quote. It would have, quote, failed in its purpose to theoretically reproduce the systematic genesis of capital, had it explained capital's functioning by recourse to a compelling condition that was not consistently, and on a mass scale reproduced within the society thus defined. In that case, it would not have derived capital, end quote. second. Almost 30 years later, the subject of preconditions is once again raised by Frieder Otto Wolff in the context of a systematic reflection on the limits of dialectical exposition. Like Müller, Wolff identifies the conscious and open engagement of the Marxian exposition, quote, with its own limits, end quote, as the differentia specifica of materialist dialectics. Going beyond what has been developed thus far, however, he points out that, even regarding the circuit of capital, moments relevant to reproduction lie beyond the limits of dialectical systemic representability. Consequently, there exist continuous external foundations for the reproduction process that are not and indeed cannot be, fully encompassed by the autopoiesis of capital. In this context, Wolff cites, among other things, non-commodified aspects of the reproduction of labor power, the constantly contested process of rendering labor power productive, which cannot automatically be assumed to be willing and loyal, and the natural conditions underlying the production of surplus value. Conversely, these factors are actually subject to systemic endangerment by the accumulation process, which, far from being a process of self-reproduction, tends itself towards the destruction of its own material and biospheric foundations. Without denying the possibility of systematic exposition, and thereby falling into the trap of a, quote, theory of action, and, quote, hubris, Wolff expands the range of phenomena that must be integrated into the exposition via, quote, empirical inclusion, end quote, even though, quote, from the perspective of its conceptual development, end quote, these phenomena must be characterized as contingent. Thus, Wolff challenges, far more fundamentally than the positions examined previously, the Hegelian methodological, quote, verbal radicalism, end quote, parenthesis, quite common even in materialist circles, end parenthesis, which refuses to acknowledge any merely empirically encountered determinants as legitimate. Thus, without any empiricist or historicist bias, description and narration emerge as not only legitimate for a materialist dialectic, even necessary elements of the scientific representation of capital. Drawing upon a distinction introduced by Nikos Palansas, Alexander Galas likewise observes that, quote, social formations based on the capitalist mode of production exist only when factors contingent to the formal nexus, i.e. factors not fully determined by it, intervene, end quote. This phenomenon, which Galas also characterizes as the divergence between the conditions of capital's existence and those of its reproduction, is illustrated by the example of Marx's account of the struggle for the normal working day. Countering both action-theoretical and structuralist reductionisms, Galas emphasizes the need to highlight, on the one hand, the form determination of class struggle, and on the other, the non-derivability of its results from the structural conditions of action. The fact that the relationship between workers and capitalists is only partially conditioned by the commodity form, specifically the fact that the duration of the working day cannot be determined by the law of value, since it concerns the consumption of a commodity labor power, which is situated outside the determinations of circulation. While the conflicting claims of the exchanging parties can equally appeal to the rights inherent in their status as commodity owners, the unrestricted use of the acquired commodity, on the one hand, versus the preservation of labor power, and thus of the status of the labor power owner, on the other, has the consequence, quote, that the actors are simultaneously arranged in a specific relation to one another and set free, end quote. Class struggle must, therefore, be understood through the forms of capitalism, yet in terms of its actual results, it cannot be derived from those very forms. In the specific case of the working day, it is thus in principle conceivable that capital, while initially encountering and reproducing the conditions of its own existence, may ultimately jeopardize those very conditions in the long run, unless, that is, certain enduring conditions of reproduction intervene, conditions that must be understood as contingent results of class struggle, specifically the legal regulation of working hours, which counteracts the counteracts the long-term destruction of labor power caused by overwork, the, quote, incompleteness of form, and, quote, elucidated here, now necessitates a mode of presentation distinct from the purely logical systematic, namely a, quote, historiographical narrative of an exemplary and generalizing character, end quote, a turn toward real historical processes within a specific social formation. And I think that's kind of like a thing, right? There's, this, like, it doesn't, talking about, say, like, the capitalism in its ideal average does not mean that by talking about, like, having a theory of capitalist mode of production as, like, an idealized, not in the sense of, like, what's the word? Sugar-coated, idealized as an idealized system, like reproduced in thought or something like that. The idea of, like, a systematic, like a dialectical systematic presentation of the capitalist mode of production, right, does not rule out the necessity of other ways of talking about capital as being fundamentally necessary to, like, understanding the history of capitalism, right? So, like, or understanding capitalism, right? Obviously, empirical research, history, case studies, all those kinds of things would remain necessary. So I think there is very much a place for historical sociology, right? That might be something different than saying, like, the critique of political economy. It might be distinct from that, right? But like a Marx influenced historical sociology. So I think that's been, like, achieved by a lot of people, particularly, like, in, like, the perhaps you might say, like, in the political Marxism tradition of, like, talking about the development and transition from feudalism to capitalism. That's still an important, like, those are still, like, very important conversations, but they kind of fall outside of the parameters of, or they're very important, like, research programs and research goals and research questions, but they kind of fall out of the circle of what is being discussed in, like, the critique of capitalism as such, on, like, the necessary theoretical, on, like, the level of, like, I don't know, describing what are the necessary and sufficient features of capitalism. I don't know why I felt the need to say that right now, but I did. Let me repeat that sentence, the last sentence I read then. The, quote, incompleteness of form, and, quote, elucidated here, now necessitates a mode of production distinct from the purely logical systematic, namely a, quote, historiographical narrative of an exemplary and generalizing character, end quote, a turn toward real historical processes within a specific social formation. This turn cannot in any way be construed as merely illustrating insights already derived through formal analysis. On the contrary, it constitutes the necessary complement to the formal analytic method itself. This also carries implications for how we understand the relationship between structure and agency, or more precisely between form and struggle, in Marx's Capital. While positions grounded in action theory or centered on struggle must indeed be reminded that forms serve not merely as indices of the historical specificity of the capitalist relations of production, but also as, quote, stabilized conditions of action, end quote, that shape the practice of social actors. Ultimately, one must affirm a fundamental parity between form and struggle. By this, Gallas refers primarily to the fact that the two exist, quote, within and through one another, end quote, yet simultaneously remain, quote, not fully reducible to one another, end quote. Furthermore, however, The fact that struggles are thematized after forms, a sequencing dictated by the logic of presentation, does not imply, quote, any real relationship of subordination, end quote. The organizational structure of the exposition in Marx's Capital simply reflects the necessity of translating synchronously existing phenomena into a sequential categorical order and of ensuring that actions are not rendered incomprehensible, as if, quote, floating in thin air, end quote. In doing so, Gallas refers to Marx's formulation from the 18th Brumaire that human beings, quote, make their own history, but they do not make it of their own free will, nor not under the self-chosen circumstances, but under circumstances found directly in existence, given and transmitted from the past, end quote. Marx thus conceives of praxis as, quote, freedom of choice under conditions, end quote. However, with this assertion of equivalence taken in a broader sense, the idea of the capitalist nexus of forms attaining an autonomous status vis-a-vis the individual and collective agency of actors is lost. Above all, the idea that the mechanisms relevant to socialization, embedded within conscious human action, operate unconsciously is ignored. It is precisely this, and not merely a formal sociological model of conditions and actions, that legitimizes the primacy of structural analysis in Marx's mode of presentation. Characteristic of this stance taken by Gallas is his initially banal thesis that the, quote, mute compulsion of capitalist forms to sell one's labor power as a commodity applies to workers who find themselves without property only for as long as, quote, workers do not view the permanent refusal of wage labor as a viable option for action, end quote. Yet the perfidious character of capitalist forms lies precisely in their serving as, quote, objectifications of individuals, social interconnections that confront them in fetishized and reified manner, end quote. That is, in their erecting through their mere existence an internal barrier to freedom of action or choice, a barrier that prevents these forms from appearing as entities subject to human transformative agency, representing them instead as natural conditions of human socialization, fetish characters, or, quote, just forms of social coexistence. Quote, the price of labor, a, quote, just wage, and, quote, etc. Naturally, however, this is not intended to deny that it remains in principle possible to break even this, quote, surplus of objectivity, end quote, a phenomenon inherent in the formal determination of action under capitalism. And there's like a new heading here, like a new heading within this section. Fallacy, genetic fallacy. Drawing upon the analytical philosopher Norwood Russell Hanson, essential aspects of the, quote, logico-historical method, or more precisely, the postulation of a, quote, dialectical unity between logical and historical perspectives, according to which the logical is nothing other than the historical, albeit simplified in an ideal typical or developmental logical manner, can be characterized as instances of the genetic fallacy. Hanson distinguishes 9 types of genetic fallacies, of which at least types 2 and 3 are relevant for characterizing Marxist methodological orthodoxy. Hanson characterizes these as follows. Type 2 implies, quote, that a genetic fallacy occurs when an explanation of S conflates the temporal order of the actual events leading up to S with the logical order in which S must be developed, end quote. Type 3 occurs, quote, when an explanation of the genesis of S is confused with an explanation of the structural nature of S, as it exists here and now. In this instance, historical development is not confused with a logical sequence leading up to S, but rather with the conceptual analysis of what S is. Genetic exposition thus takes the place of an explanation, quote, of the essence of S, end quote. Rather than, as was the case previously, taking the place of a, quote, argumentation in support of S, end quote, unquote. Norwood Russell Hanson emphasizes that genetic fallacies, in contrast to genetic explanations, result from a, quote, conflation of levels of discourse, end quote, which goes unrecognized as such. Statements regarding historical facts, therefore, operate, quote, on a level distinct from the level of statements concerned with the analysis of structures, end quote. This holds true even, quote, if the genetic account and the structural analysis are constructed from assertions of the same logical type, i.e. if they are all, quote, factual, synthetic, contingent, and a posteriori, end quote, end quote. These epistemological reservations align with the argument advanced by proponents of a new Marx reading, namely that even if a logically structural connection between determinations and their historical sequence should occasionally coincide, this historical sequence and any representation thereof, however simplified, cannot be a justificatory function for grasping the structure of capitalist form determinations. Michael Heinrich, for instance, argues as follows, quote, what is decisive, however, is not the parallelism or lack thereof between the categorical exposition and the historical development. For even if such a parallelism exists, it provides no justification for the exposition, end quote. Consequently, the interconnection of the forms of social wealth, the very existence, and thus the reproduction of the capitalist mode of production, cannot be grasped through accounts of its historical genesis, but solely through an analysis of the self-reproduction processes inherent in this formation. The dialectical character of Marx's mode of exposition, therefore, cannot lie in the conflation of structural and historical levels of discourse. What then constitutes this dialectical character is a question to be clarified in the following chapter. Okay, so that's the end of what I have been calling part one. Let me repeat that. That's the end of section 2 of chapter 2 of part 1 of Ingo Elbe's Marx in the West. Chapter 2 of section of part 1 is titled Logical, Historical, Dialectical, a departure from the methodological tradition and debates in the specificity of the Marxian method. And section 1 of that chapter is titled Key Features of Methodological Orthodoxy and the Emergence of Neo-Orthodoxy. Thank you so much for listening.